Hello and welcome back to Dicebreaker, where today we played a little game called Oath by the designer of Pax Pamir.
And Root.
So this is another publication from Later Games. It has the same fantastic art as Root because it's the, well, it doesn't have the exact same, but it's got the same artist.
They just reused it.
Yeah, they just copied and pasted everything. No, it's Cole Wehrle doing the art again.
Yes, it looks amazing.
It looks fantastic. It's got that same sort of slightly asymmetrical design, not quite to the same level as Root. But you have been following the sort of progress of both, but you haven't had a chance to play
That's
yet.
right, yeah. So technically it's today Will's played.
Yeah.
And I'm here to just kind of grill you and find out as much as I possibly can
Exactly,
about
yeah,
it.
pretty much. Yes. So like the general premise is that you're essentially sort of telling the story of like this kingdom or this empire. So every single time the game is played, you're going to sort of record the history of that game, and then it's going to influence the game that comes after it. So you've got like this little logbook almost of like which player won, what faction were they playing, and then what sort of story did they decide they were going to be telling next time we play. So it's almost like a legacy game, but it's also not, if that makes sense.
Right, because you don't destroy things.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like you're tearing up cards or putting stickers on the board.
And there's no like campaign that you're playing through. You're just sort of like recording the history of things and then also influencing things in the future. Without them being permanent, they're just sort of influencing the next thing.
Does it, from what you play, I don't know how many games you played, but does it feel like the one game will influence the next game, but then the next game after that, you know, 2 games back doesn't really make much of a difference? I don't know.
From what we saw, that seemed to be the case. Where
Okay.
it was so basically the way the sort of like the chain carries on is that you've got 4 players or more or less, and then one of those players is playing as the Chancellor. So they are the person in power right now. Everyone else starts exiled because basically they've been ousted from this sort of like civilization, and then through the game they can become citizens again.
Wow.
But then at the end of every game, as far as I'm aware, I have a question about that as well. But as far as I'm aware, everyone will then start again as an exile in the next round.
Okay.
But then whoever won the game last time will become the Chancellor.
Right.
And then they will choose which objective they'll be filling next time they play. So there's like a few different game modes. So there might be, so the one that we played was like rule the most sites, which is literally just like area control. But then the one after that might be, for example, have the most influence over a certain community or something like that. So the way that it sort of positions itself at the start is all based on what happened last time. But I don't think the game after that will then be affected as well. It'll more just be the fact that you'll have more context to it.
Right, okay. So, and it's also not the case that you have to keep playing it with the same group like a legacy game. You can just bring in some other people.
Yeah,
they
drop
can be
people
the
in
Chancellor.
and out, and then they'll have an idea of what happened last time because you can just like tell them through the history of the book. But then also it won't influence them having to play in a certain way. It will just mean that, okay, you're playing as an exile because the person that played before you lost the game, essentially. But the interesting thing for me, like that's a cool concept, but the interesting thing for me is the sort of like depth of the mechanics that are like in the system, which it's a Cole Wehrle game.
Yeah, I was going to say, coming from Cole Wehrle, knowing
Yeah.
the kind of, because Root is kind of one game of you learned 5 different games because the birds play different to the cats, which play different to the Woodland Alliance. Whereas Pax Pamir is everyone's doing kind of the same thing, but the more cards you play down, it quickly goes from, oh, play a card, use a card, to, oh, now I have a whole table full of cards and they all do different things. So this sounds like it's more along those kinds of lines than these kinds of lines.
Yes, so there's a lot of card play. So like the way that the game sort of looks, we're going to have some assets that are being sent over to show on screen. Obviously, we don't have the game in front of us, so a little bit more like abstract descriptions coming. But and we were also playing like print and play assets, so they weren't like the final. I think they were the final art.
Because I think it's out next year, so
Yeah,
it's still
exactly.
a ways off, and I think some things could change.
Yeah. But from what we played, we had like a big board, and it was separated into 3 sections. So you had like the mainland of the empire, then you had like the sort of the outskirts, and then you had what was called the hinterland, which was like literally far off in the distance. And the more that you got like away from the capital city, the more difficult it was to travel. So it would take more what's called effort, which is basically like a track that goes up, and then you have to rest to reset it. And the more effort that you expend, the less troops you can carry as well.
Right.
Because if you've got a big heavy army, it limits the amount of like maneuverability you have. So we were sort of like going between sort of sites in all of these sections. So within the 3 sections, they've also got 3 separate areas in those as well. And they'll all have their own special rule for what they do and all that kind of thing. It's already complex and I'm just describing the map. But but then you've got like sort of special movement rules of like how you move between those things. Right. So you can almost wrap around, I think, as well. So like for a certain amount of movement points, you can go between the sections, or then it's cheaper to just move from area to area inside of that one. But then it's all quite abstract, but in a way that makes sense. The more interesting thing, though, is that whenever you're using an area, you can basically excavate these cards from certain decks. So each area will have its own deck, and then once cards are discarded from that deck, they move down to the next area.
Okay, right.
Once cards are discarded from that deck, they move down to the next area. But then if you grab a card and choose to play it, you can play it to the area rather than to your own personal supply, because you only have space for 3 cards in front of you. So suddenly, all of the abilities that you've built up are tied to this place that can be taken by other people. Wow. Which is quite interesting.
And I think there's a couple hundred cards, like a lot more cards than I think maybe even Pax Pamir, but definitely more than Root. Yeah. So it feels like only having 3 is kind of, you have to choose what you're doing quite carefully.
So the most interesting thing about the cards in front of you is the fact that every single card in the game is sort of linked to a certain like micro faction that's outside of the ones that you're playing. Right. So you might have like the Order faction or the Disorder faction or the Nomads or like the Magicians or whatever. And they have this little track that's sort of on the board that shows how powerful they are, which is basically how much money has been stacked on top of them. So when it comes to resting, you reassign your public order or your public opinion, sorry. So like you have a track, which is like how popular you are basically with the actual people who live in this society. So the more influence that gets placed on one group of people, the more like import that you get from them liking you. So if you have more, let's say, Nomad cards in your personal supply than anybody else around the table, then you get all of the influence added to your public opinion. Right. The reason that's interesting is because once you stop being an exile and start being a citizen, you win the game with the Chancellor, but you're also like moved onto a separate victory point tracker where you're trying to become more prestigious than them. So you're playing a sort of like Game of Thrones style, trying to like become the more influential person without actually going to war. So if the Chancellor tries to get rid of you by exiling you again, it becomes more difficult to do that for every sort of like bar of the public opinion that goes up. Because if you're really popular with everyone, then they'll be like, "How dare you exile us?"
They're just spreading propaganda.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's so many interlocking systems, and none of it felt like it shouldn't be there. It was all very much like it was as elegant as it could be.
I was going to say, so was it relatively easy to look at and go, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm moving my armies here, I'm trying to get influence, or did it feel, heavy? Did it feel like it would take a handful of plays to just
absolutely
understand?
Not a beginner board game, that's for sure. But it was very much like, it has that same sort of philosophy that I think he has in a few games where it's like, you look at your board and you just follow the steps. So it's like, okay, step 1 you do this, step 2 you do this, step 3 you do this, and then you move your turn over. The Chancellor was slightly more complex because he had a few extra bits going on, whereas everybody else was just sort of playing with the core mechanics. And then they could interact with my systems by becoming citizens or however you like. Some of the more sort of like strange things were that you've got 2 types of meeple that go on the board. So you've got your main meeple, which represents you. Right. And you can then hold armies on your board that are in that meeple. So that's like your attacking force. So you have like a cohort. Right. But then whenever you leave soldiers to defend, they get taken off your cohort and placed on the map, and they're a small little like banner holding guy. So like there's like so many different levels of abstraction where it's like, oh god, okay, right, no, but that's actually a lot stronger than it looks, because if I look at the player board, he's got like 8 soldiers just sat on his cohort right now, and he's there. There's also this strange thing where if you attack a region, you can attack every other region with the same controller by spending more effort.
Right, so
or not spending more effort.
Say, for instance, you had multiple places and I attacked you. I could attack you even if I just had my army in one place where we actually shared. Yeah, so like, for example, if you're up here in the capital and you've got 2 areas here, and then you've got one area like way out in the hinterlands that you can control, I can attack that hinterland area,
and the other two
Right.
areas.
So it's just a general kind of we're at war kind of.
It's like the positioning of everything on the map is really abstract, and I think that was one of the most difficult things to try and wrap my head around. Was like, I don't know where anything actually is. But it had this interesting thing of like, instead of doing battles in which you're sort of like, okay, here's your troops, here's my troops, you can sort of push your luck a bit.
Okay.
So you have like this sort of like ratio thing, which was probably the least elegant part of the game, where you place your pawn on this little tracker based on the ratio of your soldiers to theirs.
Okay.
So let's say that you've got, I don't know, you've got like 10 troops to their like 5, you have a 2-to-1 ratio. And then that's going to push you up into the blue area, which is success.
Okay.
Red area is defeat. So then if you finish a battle after rolling the dice and it tells you to move your pawn a certain amount of spaces, you then have to kill a troop to move every single space.
Right.
So you can win the battle and just sort of dislocate them by not losing any forces if you have that much of an advantage. But then if it's a bit more close and you end up only 1-to-1, which is still a red square, then you need to start losing people.
Right.
And that's always your choice as well. So if you're like, oh, I can't afford that, then you can just choose to lose the battle without losing any forces.
That's kind of interesting. I guess it stops you just piling people into
Exactly.
one place,
Yeah,
because once you get to a certain point, there's no benefit.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot, and it's really hard to explain without like showing what's there and just playing through it. Like, it's a really like high concept kind of game.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Root, the combat was kind of dice based. There was a bit of that. Pax Pamir was kind of, you didn't really fight directly. You just kind of assassinated people behind the scenes. Whereas this feels like another step in a different direction.
This one feels a lot more like it's sort of harking into like a traditional war game, I think.
Right.
Although, to be fair, Root is very sort of traditional war game, but it's like this one is a lot more sort of. It reminded me a lot, and not in a sort of. Because I'm hesitant to say this because I don't like the Game of Thrones board game. However, it reminded me a lot of the Game of Thrones board game in the way that it has that sort of like, yeah, this is a war game, but also there's levels on top of it that you're actually like interacting with a lot more. Yeah, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
As well as being fascinating, did it feel like something that was fun? Like, was it a kind of thing that you play a couple times and go, wow, this is really clever, but I don't really want to.
I'm not going to pull it out on a lazy Sunday.
Or, or was there something to keep you coming back other than the, like, I played a couple games, seen how it filters through, seen how this works, kind of done with it?
Because of the nature of the event, we only got to play it once.
Fair.
Which means that, like, I wouldn't trust my own opinion on this. However, like, there was like interesting and fun things happening. It wasn't just like, oh, that was really fun to sort of like pick apart and understand how it works. It was also just like, oh, that was clever. I like what you did there. Kind of like, there's a lot of systems in which you can be like, oh, actually, if I go down this avenue instead, this is going to become even more powerful in the specific situation that we're in. And it feels quite fun to sort of explore all those different, because there's so many interlocking systems, you can go in 4 different directions to perform the exact same ability kind of thing. If that makes sense?
Yeah. And do you also feel like did it feel dry? Because you kind of said it's abstract in the areas on the map, and obviously Root, you can get into the mind of, oh, I'm the cats, I'm doing this thing.
It felt a lot less colourful.
Right, okay.
Yeah, despite the art being very lovely, it felt a lot less sort of like, sort of vibrant. It was a lot more political and like more towards the Pax Pamir spectrum, whereas I feel like we've set up like a grid here where like, where are we landing? Like, but yeah, it was definitely a bit more sort of like, we're talking about citizenship and like the force of different sort of manpower strengths of different communities and things like that. It was a bit less, I'm a cool cat person and I can stab you in the face. One of the sort of like, one of my favourite things about it, I think, is the fact that you cannot do anything in the game without affecting something else, possibly in a negative way. So you're always like, do you remember that Dog Rush game we played?
Yeah, I do remember that Dog Rush
Every
game,
time you pick up a cable, you're picking everything else up with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, it's like, it's very much like a sort of a system where you can't isolate one mechanic.
Yeah, sort of, I guess coming back to Root, sort of in that way that they feel like they mesh together. Yeah. And you're like, oh, this person's doing this and it affects me this way.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas like with this, it's like, okay, I want to recruit some soldiers. So now I look at the area that I'm in. So let's say that I'm in like a region that's called like, the Wildlands or something, and I've got cards next to me. So, okay, well, we've got a nomad card here, so I'm going to recruit some nomad soldiers. So they all like come out as my soldiers in the end, but then they're sourced from these little pools with the resources on them, and you eat up the resources to recruit the soldiers. So suddenly, if you're like king of the nomads, and the nomads are really important, and that's keeping you in position as a citizen of the city or empire or whatever it is, but then you need to recruit soldiers, you are dwindling the manpower of the nomads, which means that when you next rest, your public opinion will also get down because there's less people to be happy with you in the ones that you've put all of your resources in. But then not only that, it means that if you were to sort of try and branch out and have multiple people that you're sort of tied with in your personal court, I think it's called, then you're not specializing, which means that other people are more likely to have more cards than you, which means that you only get half the benefit.
Right.
So yeah,
Wow.
there's just like there's every little decision is like a domino effect where it's just like, okay, I've influenced the entire game by just doing this small thing. And that's like the thing that stands out to me the most is like, this is really smart.
Yeah, that sounds like what they're going for, both I guess on a big and a small scale. Like, oh, this game plays into the next one, but also this one small decision.
Down at the mechanical level.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah. I'm intrigued about this. I mean, so far, Cole Wehrle's had kind of an impeccable record.
Yeah.
So I have no doubt that this will be
he's
interesting.
Just, you can tell he's a very smart man, like far smarter than I am. But like, yeah, it was definitely like, it was something that I was more interested in than excited for, I think, was the only sort of like criticism I had. It was definitely something that I was like, wow, I can't wait to talk about this, not necessarily play it forever, you know? So yeah, it's difficult to say at the moment, but from what I saw, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and again, it's like a year away, so who knows how it might change. It sounds like there's at least the kind of, it sounds like it's doing things that I haven't really seen in a board game before. Like we've mentioned legacy games, mentioned a bit of this, a bit of that, but as a whole, it feels like there hasn't really been a board game that locks all this stuff together and makes it kind of spiral onwards.
It's definitely very unique, I think, and there are elements of the game that you can see in other things. Like as you'll sort of sit there and go, oh, okay, this kind of reminds me of that. I know how that works now. But there are definitely things where I've like, okay, I've never seen this before. This is like an interesting take on this. One of my criticisms is that, especially coming, because I haven't played Pax Pamir, which is your favourite game of all time.
I love it.
But I know that in Pax Pamir, you yourself are not very sort of well defined. It's more the context that you have.
Yeah, so
based on the cards that you're playing.
You're
into.
kind of small tribal leaders, and it's the big armies. You're just trying to side with them and gain influence, rather than you controlling those armies directly.
This had a similar feeling where it's like, so it's the opposite of that kind of route where it's like you are very much this army, which is different from everyone else. Whereas with this, like it has all of the really nice sort of like unique sort of character designs for each of the factions. But the Chancellor was the only one who was actually different. Right. So like the cloud-looking people and the trying to think of what the other factions look like now. Like the orange and the white player are both functionally exactly the same, and it's only through the actions of the game that they become different.
Got it.
Which is very much like considering it has the same sort of like vibrant, beautiful art style as Root. I think that's why there was a bit of a disconnect for me, because it was like, these look so different. Why are they all exactly the same kind of thing?
Yeah, and the Chancellor sounds like they have something slightly different, but they're still within a certain. They're not playing a vastly different game like in Post.
they just have more like sway, I think. So like they have, you know, their soldiers work exactly the same. It's very much that kind of like the cats in Root. They start with most of the map under their control, but then they sort of like cede power, and it's how well you can manage that sort of downfall and then bring back. Because you've got basically 3 people fighting you. Because at the start, you're the only real person with territory, so they're just going to take off you. Yeah. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it's like, it looks fantastic. I really like the art direction that Kyle's taken with it, because it's still got that signature Kyle line work, and like it's very much
you look at it as something and you go, that's Kyle.
That's Kyle Ferrin, but without being like, oh, that just looks like Root but different. It's very much like oh, okay, no, those are really visually distinct, and like, it's an interesting fantasy world that he's made, which is why I found it slightly disappointing that all of the factions didn't evoke that in the actual play.
Do you think that people, because I mean, Root did a kind of similar thing where you look at it, it's like, oh, cute cats and birds, and then you play it's like, wow, this is
dark.
pretty crunchy. Yeah, they're like killing each other.
Yeah.
Do you think it will have a similar thing of people being maybe like drawn in by the artwork and going like, oh, this seems really almost friendly, and then going, whoa, this is
I think it has that same sort of effect of like Quest, the artwork in the Quest RPG is very vibrant and colourful and playful and fun, but it's also like, you can tell it's high fantasy, like swords and sorcery, like you can tell what you're getting out of that. I think this has a similar thing where it's like, yeah, it's very colourful and vibrant and that sort of like cartoonish style to it, but also the things that it's depicting are very much like, you know, horseback soldiers and like famine and all that kind of stuff, where it's like, yeah, okay, it's not just pretty pictures, you know? Yeah, exactly. So difficult to say where this is going to stand for me when it comes out, when it's a final product, just to be clear, like this is not out yet, this is just our sort of initial impressions, but I mean, I want to see more, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, both of these games, they take a little, I think I said before, but Pax Pamir, well, the first time I played it, I didn't like it at all.
Yeah.
I just sat there and just was like, I don't really get this. It was that thing of, I know that there's something here, but I'm not enjoying it right now. And so I'm hoping that at least your kind of initial experience, it sounds a lot more positive than actually I was with Pax Pamir, which I now love. So I'm hoping that maybe over a couple of plays,
but then there's also
really bed in.
There's also the danger that it's like, it seems really cool at first, and then you're just like, actually, this is a bit too sloggy. And,
or it doesn't change enough from game to game, and it just,
Yeah, I think the fact that there are different win conditions to sort of like have your gameplay in. I think my favourite thing, like, to make it varied is the fact that the power dynamic can completely change. Like, you can have a game in which there is a Chancellor and 3 citizens. Like, everyone's theoretically on the same side, but you're still fighting amongst yourselves to actually be the most prestigious. Yeah. So it's really interesting, and it's I've said interesting about 8 times now, but like it's fascinating how much there is to pick apart.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to see what it really looks like when you've had, like, you know, 4 games in a row. Because they've also set it up in a way that you could theoretically play for half an hour to an hour. It was quite quick, actually. I don't know if I mentioned that. It was actually, like, it sped by.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a lot going on, but I wanted to ask about, because you obviously were kind of learning and playing it at the same time, I guess. But
which slowed it down, obviously. But, like, they had, like, this little tracker. And it's... Have you ever played Warhammer 40,000?
I have played Warhammer 40,000.
You know, when you reach a certain turn, you roll the die to see if the game ends or not, and then that roll becomes more and more likely with each turn. It has the same thing where it's like, you know, on a 6, the game will end. On a 5, the game will end. On a 4, the game will end.
Oh,
so, like,
smart.
Theoretically, it could end real quick, or it could sort of, like, drag out if you're lucky, kind of thing.
Is there the chance it could end almost immediately? Is there a small chance of, even if you roll a 1 in 6?
There's always a set amount of turns that you always play,
right,
and then the roll comes in.
So it's not like turn 2, that's it, pack up, we're done.
But I think that's supposed to be like the, you know, oh, the king has died, or something like that, right? It's like, you can't always tell when the next level of the dynasty is going to start becoming important.
Is that the only kind of die or dice you're throwing as well? It sounds like most of it's cards.
There's dice in combat,
which
give you, which basically says, because you start on your track and then you roll a die to see if you go up or down.
Oh, right.
I think the best result you can get on the dice is for nothing to happen.
Right.
So, like, everything is usually, no, you get knocked down a few pegs. Like, basically it's...
Bad to worse.
Yeah, how much difficulty have you had to try and get the maneuver that you're planning to pull off, essentially. But yeah, it's really cool.
It's interesting.
It's fascinating and interesting and all the words that I keep saying. But yeah, so stay tuned for more coverage on that in the future. We're obviously, so this is one of the games that we played at PAX East. We're going to be talking about a few other things that we played. That was from the Later Games stand, and they had another game there called Fort, which I was incredibly passionate about. Yeah.
That's all I want is just Carl Ferrenard.
Inject it into my veins. So look out for our coverage on that as well. If you want to see some more sort of written content and editorials and guides and reviews and all kinds of things from our written team, then Matt Jarvis leads them haphazardly over on the other side of the desk. Over on Dicebreaker.com, so go and have a look at that. And then obviously if you would like more video content like this, or more Let's Plays or RPG content.
And the Root RPG, which has Carl Ferren's
Exactly. If you want to see more of that as well, then please subscribe to this channel that you're watching right now and click on the bell icon to get a notification every time we put a video live. You'll also see some videos on the bottom half of the screen, which you can click on right now if you'd like some recommendations. But until we see you in the next video, have a lovely day.